Sunlight, softened to a warm, dusty gold by cream-colored curtains, fell across Silas's tangled sheets. He woke to the gentle, rhythmic weight of her shifting beside him. In the morning's quiet hush, Ilara looked entirely human, her sharp eyes softened by sleep, her dark hair fanned across the pillow like spilled ink. She leaned over him, her lips cool and steady against his forehead. "You were wonderful last night," she whispered, a playful but sincere glint in her eyes. "Your energy, it's so vibrant. I'm impressed." To Silas, it was the highest praise from the woman who was the only constant in his chaotic life of temp work and late-night shifts. The air in the apartment carried the sense of scorched toast and overbrewed coffee as they sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table. Ilara was already transforming, pulling her hair back into that severe, perfect bun and buttoning the high collar of her charcoal dress. She ate with a precise, delicate grace, watching him over the rim of her mug. "The curator is expecting the overnight reports," she said, checking the thin silver watch on her wrist. "And Julian is already fussing about the temperature logs in the basement." They left together, the cool morning air a shock against their skin as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The city was just beginning to stir, its distant hum a low, metallic throb. At the corner bus stop, she turned to him, adjusting his hoodie strings with a proprietary touch. "We can probably go out Friday. It looks like I will have a night off finally," she said as she jumped on and headed for work. He watched her board the bus, the faint jingle of her silver bell muffled in her pocket, until the vehicle vanished around the bend. Silas turned toward the park entrance, the wrought iron gates standing open like a mouth. The grass was a deep, lush green, still shimmering with a heavy dew that felt a bit too thick, and the shadows beneath the ancient oaks seemed to linger just a second longer than they should. As he stepped onto the gravel path, the city sounds began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic crunch-crunch of his sneakers and a faint, high-pitched whistling in the trees that sounded almost like wind blowing through a very thin, hollow bone. The park was an explosion of early spring, a masterpiece of landscape architecture that felt almost aggressive in its vibrancy. Huge, ancient elms leaned over the walkway, their branches knitting together to create a vaulted canopy of translucent green. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in shifting, golden shafts, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, silent spirits. The air was thick and sweet, smelling of freshly mowed grass and the heavy, floral perfume of blossoming lilacs. Every few yards, a manicured flower bed erupted from the soil, tulips in shades of bruised violet and blood orange, their petals so waxy and perfect they looked as if they had been sculpted from fine porcelain. The grass was a deep, impossible emerald, shimmering with a dew that didn't just wet his sneakers, but seemed to cling to the rubber in thick, clear beads. As he neared the center of the park, the sounds of life began to bloom. A group of toddlers was gathered near a duck pond, their high-pitched giggles echoing across the sapphire water. They were playing a frantic game of tag, their small bodies darting through the light like bright, erratic sparks. One little girl in a sun-yellow dress spun in circles until she fell, laughing up at the sky, her eyes bright and unblinking. Near her, an old man sat on a weathered oak bench, meticulously tearing a loaf of white bread into tidy, geometric squares for the pigeons that gathered at his feet in a fluttering, gray carpet. Further down the slope, the playground was a chaotic symphony of motion. The rhythmic creak-creak of the swings provided a steady backbeat to the shouting of older children as they scrambled over the iron climbing frames. From this distance, their jerky, energetic movements against the bright blue sky were a picture of perfect, innocent joy. A young mother sat nearby on a picnic blanket, her long black hair spilling over her shoulders as she leaned over a stroller, whispering a soft, melodic lullaby to a child Silas couldn't see. Silas strolled through the park, a gentle rhythm in his step that matched the peaceful afternoon. The sun bathed everything in a golden light, casting soft, dappled shadows that danced across the rolling green lawns. He passed by the large, circular fountain, where water arced in shimmering ribbons before splashing with a soothing melody into the stone basin below. The gentle cascade blended harmoniously with the distant chirping of birds perched high in the elm branches. To his left, a group of children gathered on a sun-drenched patch of grass. Their laughter rang out like tiny bells as they ran back and forth, kicking a bright red ball in a friendly game of soccer. Their sneakers patted softly against the turf, and their voices rose in joyful exclamations. Parents sat on nearby benches, some lost in the pages of books, while others watched the game with warm smiles, nodding to one another as they soaked in the pleasant afternoon. Further along the path, the flower beds burst with life. Rows of marigolds and petunias painted stripes of vibrant orange and soft pink against the dark, damp earth. Silas noticed a gardener kneeling near a hedge, his movements careful and deliberate as he trimmed stray branches with silver shears. The air carried the clean, invigorating scent of freshly cut greenery. Near the playground, the atmosphere was even more cheerful. Kids lined up for the big blue slide, their faces bright with anticipation, while others scrambled up the rope ladders of the jungle gym. He watched two boys racing to the top of the monkey bars, their flushed faces glowing with effort and delight. A golden retriever on a long leash bounded joyfully toward a frisbee, its paws barely disturbing the grass as it ran. Silas followed the winding gravel path, which crunched softly under his feet as he moved toward the park's exit. Families were spread out on picnic blankets, sharing sandwiches and sipping from thermoses. A young couple tossed a ball to a toddler, just learning to catch, their laughter drifting like music through the open space. The entire park felt alive and serene, filled with the simple, joyful moments of a weekend morning. The warmth from the sidewalk radiated gently as Silas approached the umbrella-top cart. The vendor, a man with a kind smile and a clean apron, handed him a hot dog wrapped in a thin, translucent sheet of wax paper. The bun was soft and warm, the sausage juicy and flavorful as he took the first bite. He found a green-slatted iron bench, the metal cool against his thighs, and settled in to enjoy his meal. Halfway through the meal, the world stuttered. It began not as a cough, but as a theft. Silas drew breath, and the air simply vanished from his chest. A hollow space bloomed where his lungs should have been, an emptiness that filled not with air, but with a thick, clotted darkness, like old blood congealing in his veins. He tried to gasp, a desperate, hitching pull of his diaphragm, but his ribs felt fused, locked around a cavity of solidified dread. The air itself had turned to poison, thin and sharp as broken glass, shredding his throat on the way down. His rib cage froze, and he could not force it to open to bring the air within. Panic, cold and serpentine, coiled in his gut. His fingernails, white-tipped with terror, clawed at the skin of his own throat, trying to tear an opening that wasn't there. He was drowning on dry land. The world at the edges of his vision bled into a bruised, pulsating purple, the green of the park grass curling in on itself like burning paper. A figure lunged from the blur of faces, arms wrapping around him like the constricting coils of a python. The Heimlich thrusts were brutal, a series of violent, percussive blows against his sternum. Each impact sent a shockwave through his frame, but dislodged nothing. The obstruction wasn't physical. It was a profound, metaphysical failure, his very biology betraying him. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into a monstrous, buzzing drone, the sound of 1,000 wasps trapped in a jar. The wail of sirens sliced through the cacophony, a harbinger of useless aid. Silas felt the cool, damp kiss of grass against his cheek as his body finally gave way, his heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He was hyper-aware of everything. The metallic scent of his own fear, the elongated shadows of his saviors twisting like grasping claws, the frigid bite of the blood pressure cuff as it bit into his arm, a snake constricting its prey. They moved with a practiced, desperate urgency. A plastic mask was forced over his face, the hiss of oxygen a cruel taunt. He heard the air rushing in, but felt only the suffocating weight of nothingness filling his lungs. The paramedics' voices, clipped and sharp, spoke of vitals that made no sense, a body that was defying all logic. As they hoisted him onto the gurney, the world spun, the canopy of friendly, leafy trees replaced by the stark, unforgiving white of the ambulance roof. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, a silent witness as the doors slammed shut, the metallic clang of the latch sounding like the lid of his coffin ceiling. The paramedics' professional calm curdled into raw, naked fear. Silas was awake, his eyes wide and darting, watching their faces contort from focused competence to pale, slack-jawed horror. He felt every jolt, every shudder of the vehicle, but his chest remained a sealed tomb, a vacuum where life should have been. The hospital was a nightmare of strobing fluorescent lights and the rhythmic, clacking bones of the gurney on polished floors. He was swept into a trauma bay where doctors descended, not as healers, but as ghouls. He felt the cold, violating kiss of the scalpel as they cut into his throat, a desperate, bloody violation to save him. But it was futile. He watched, detached, as a dark spray of his own lifeblood stained the front of Dr. Scrub's, felt the cold, invasive pressure of the tube sliding into the incision, and still his lungs remained 2 stones in his chest. "He's gone," a voice shrieked, but Silas was not gone. His heart hammered a terrified, frantic tattoo against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure terror only he could hear. The machines screamed their lie, a flat, monotonous tone of finality. The word dead was spoken with the casual indifference of a grocery clerk announcing a price. Silas felt the immediate chill as the warmth of purpose drained from the room. Then came the morgue attendant, frank, his face a mask of weary boredom, his aura the stale scent of cheap coffee and decay. He didn't search for life. He simply unzipped a heavy, black vinyl shroud, the sound of the teeth parting like a grotesque sigh. The zipper was the most monstrous sound of all, a long, jagged tearing that began at his feet and crawled up his body like some carnivorous insect. It sealed over his legs, his waist, his chest, each inch a new layer of hell. He tried to scream, to thrash, to tear his own eyes from their sockets, but his muscles were petrified, his body a perfect, horrifying effigy of a corpse. The plastic, the rough, cold hands of the orderlies were like dead weights on his skin, dragging his unresponsive body across the sterile sheets. The vertigo of being rolled over sent a nauseating wave through him, but his face remained a rigid, waxy mask. They manhandled the thick, black body bag underneath him, the plastic frigid against his back, reeking of antiseptic and the suffocating stench of trapped breath from 1,000 previous occupants. He was awake, a prisoner trapped behind his own unblinking eyelids, when the zipper began its ascent. Ziz-zip. The sound was a razor-sharp shriek tearing through the morgue's oppressive silence. He felt the metallic teeth scrape past his ankles, then his shins, the thick plastic cinching tighter with every inch, a cold, synthetic coffin closing around his legs. Zizzip. It crawled over his hips, the rough fabric of his uniform pressing into his skin as the bag constricted. The air inside grew thick and foul, a nauseating cocktail of his own cold sweat and the lingering ghost of the hot dog he'd choked down just moments before. Inside the silent, screaming cathedral of his mind, he was a frantic prisoner, begging his own nerves for a single betraying tremor, a flicker of an eyelash, anything to shatter this horrifying charade. Ziz-zip. The zipper sealed over his face, the last sliver of light extinguished with a final, damning hiss. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blackness that pressed in on him from all sides. He felt himself lifted, his dead weight slumping in the center of the bag like discarded meat. Every jolt of the gurney sent a new tremor of pure terror through his paralyzed form. The squeal of a neglected wheel was a nails-on chalkboard torture, and the distant, distorted classic rock from a radio was a mocking anthem for his entombment. A sudden, Arctic blast hit the bag, so cold it felt like needles against the plastic. A heavy metallic clank resonated through him. The gurney jolted violently as he was slid forward, his body gliding over steel rollers that shrieked and groaned, the sound amplified within his plastic prison into a deafening subterranean roar. Thud! His feet slammed into the back of the metal locker. The gurney was withdrawn, leaving him in solitude. Then came the sound of finality, the heavy iron door swinging shut, its groan a lament for the living. The bolt slid home with a resolute, metallic clang, the sound of his world being erased. Silas lay in the lightless, frozen crypt, his heart a frantic bird beating uselessly against the bars of his silent ribcage. Buried alive in a stainless steel tomb, he strained his hearing, praying for any sound other than the thunder of his own terror. Then he heard it, a soft, wet slithering sound pressing against the outside of his plastic shroud. The heavy iron door of the locker shrieked open, the sound like a crypt being violated. Silas felt a violent vibration as the metal tray he lay on was wrenched forward, the rollers beneath him screaming a high-pitched, metallic death rattle. The air that flooded the space was an icy slap, colder even than the freezer's breath, carrying the cloying sweetness of formaldehyde and the bitter, stale scent of long-dead coffee. The zipper of the body bag began its jagged downward crawl. The plastic teeth snagged once, twice before the shroud was peeled back like a second skin. Silas lay there, staring up at the flickering fluorescent tiles of the ceiling, his eyes still locked in that terrifying, unblinking rigor, a perverse invitation. Frank didn't move toward the gleaming instruments or the sterile paperwork. Instead, a heavy, oppressive silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of Frank's ragged, uneven breathing, a sound that mimicked the rhythm of a desperate rut. Silas felt the man's shadow fall over him, a cold weight that felt more invasive than the freezer, a prelude to a different kind of violation. Then came the touch, a humid, trembling hand that lacked any clinical grace. It slid across Silas's neck, the fingers lingering on the skin with a sickening, proprietary heat that promised a defilement more profound than death. Frank began to murmur, a low, wet gurgle of words that weren't meant for the living, his voice thick with a twisted, desperate hunger. Silas felt the man's weight press against the side of the table, the plastic apron crinkling with a sound like breaking bones, a cheap barrier between them that did nothing to hide the intent behind the pressure. Then came the violation, a violation that transcended the physical, as a thick, cloying fluid, cold as grave dirt and smelling of antiseptic and something vaguely chemical like old battery acid, was pressed with deliberate, sickening slowness onto his rectum. The pressure was immense, a foreign, invasive presence that forced its way past the clenched, unyielding ring of muscle. It was a cold, slimy invasion, a violation so profound it felt like his very soul was being defiled, his mind screaming behind the prison of his paralyzed flesh. His legs, dead weights, just moments before, were now being manipulated with a rough, impersonal strength. Frank's hands, calloused and damp, clamped around his ankles, the grip like iron manacles. His knees were forced upward, the joints protesting with a silent, internal shriek of pain that only Silas could feel, until they were bent toward his chest. Then, with a final brutal wrench, they were spread wide, splayed in a position of grotesque, obscene vulnerability, his body a canvas for this man's depravity. The cold metal of the autopsy table bit into his shoulder blades, a sharp counterpoint to the searing, internal violation, his body a grotesque puppet dancing to the tune of a madman's whim. The weight of the silence was broken by a sharp, sudden intake of breath, not from Frank, but from deep within Silas's own dormant lungs. It was as if a spark had finally caught in the darkness. The paralysis that had held his limbs in a vice-like grip began to fracture, replaced by a searing, pins and needles sensation that burned through his veins, a painful, electric promise of reawakening, of a violence yet to come. The hand descended, a five-fingered spider crawling through the sterile air. Silas's fingers spasmed against the freezing metal, not a movement, but a seizure of pure rejection. A shudder, violent and sickening, racked his frame as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to beat its way out of bone and flesh. His eyelids flew open, the glaze of death scoured away by a flash of animal terror. His pupils dilated to black pits. Frank's face, a mask of twisted obsession hovering just inches away, shattered. The dark hunger in his eyes curdled into a raw, gibbering fear as he saw Silas awaken. He tried to scramble back, a strangled gasp catching in his throat, but Silas was a blur of motion. A fist, knuckles white, erupted upward. The sound was a wet, percussive thud, a piece of meat being slapped on a stone slab. Frank's head snapped sideways, a spray of spittle and blood arcing through the air as he was flung into a tower of stainless steel. The trays didn't just fall. They cascaded, an avalanche of shrieking, clattering metal that tore the silence. Frank didn't have time to register the pain. Before a scream could form, Silas was on him, launching himself from the table like a predator from a perch. His legs, dead in useless moments before, pistoned with a desperate, explosive force. His gaze locked on a chrome canister on a nearby counter, its weight a promise. He snatched it, his fingers slick with sweat, and swung it in a brutal, downward arc. It connected with Frank's temple with a sound like a ripe melon splitting open. The man's eyes rolled back, showing the whites, and he folded, his body a sack of wet sand collapsing onto the unforgiving tiles. The air in the room was a thick soup of antiseptic and fresh blood. Silas gagged, his lungs burning as he tore at the blue scrubs on the unconscious man. His hands were trembling so badly his fingers felt like disjointed claws, fumbling with the fabric, ripping in his haste. He pulled the blood-warmed cloth over his own clammy skin, the heat a nauseating, living thing against his own cold flesh. He staggered, a newborn foal on legs of broken glass, toward the door. Each step was an agony, the sound of his own feet on the linoleum a squelching march. He ignored the polished doors of the main elevators, slithering instead into the raw concrete maw of the service stairwell. Each flight was a vertical hell, his muscles screaming, but the image of Frank's face, or worse, Frank waking, drove him on like a hot poker. He shouldered through a heavy steel door and collapsed into the humid night of the ambulance bay, the city air tasting of exhaust and decay. The cityscape was a jagged wound of neon against a black sky. Silas crouched low, a hunted animal scuttling along the hospital's perimeter, his thoughts a frantic, buzzing swarm. The walk home was a pilgrimage through a charnel house. The air felt viscous, clinging to his skin like shrouds. The buzzing of the corner signs was no longer a hum, but the drone of a million insects, and his own body was a stranger's, a stolen vehicle. His joints ground together with every step, and under the strobing streetlights, his skin had the waxy, translucent pallor of a thing long dead. The door to his unit gaped open, propped by a rust-stained industrial bucket, leaking something dark and viscous. From within came wet, tearing sounds, like fabric being ripped from flesh, punctuated by the clink of glass on linoleum. Silas pushed into the entryway, a foreign coldness spreading from his chest, his heart a sluggish drum against his ribs. "Who's here?" The question scraped from his throat, the sound of dried leaves skittering across pavement. Mr. Henderson, the superintendent, whirled around. His barrel chest seemed to strain the fabric of his work shirt, veins standing out on his thick neck. He clutched one of Silas's shoe boxes, not with his hands, but with the fleshy, pinkish pads of his distended fingertips, which seemed too long for his palms. The box fell, and old receipts fluttered down, not like leaves but like shed skin. Color drained from Henderson's face, leaving it the gray of old meat. His jaw unhinged with a soft click, and he stumbled back, his spine colliding with the kitchen counter with a wet thud. "Silas." Henderson's voice was a choked whisper. His hands scrabbled on the counter, not for a flashlight, but for a heavy meat cleaver resting beside a half-eaten block of cheese. They said your body was found. In the park. 3 days ago. 3 days. The words felt alien in Silas's mouth. He lurched forward, the kitchen tilting at a nauseating angle. He gripped the back of a chair, the cheap wood groaning under the pressure. I'm not. I'm right here. I saw the report, kid. The signature, the tag on your toe. Henderson's voice rose, a panicked squeal. He brandished the cleaver, the light glinting on its edge. Stay back. You smell wrong. Like damp soil. It was a mistake. Silas's shout tore from him, a wet, ragged sound. His lungs felt full of fluid. The morgue, the drawer. I woke up inside the cold, dark box. I had to break the latch from the inside with my... He trailed off, holding up his hands. Under the stark kitchen light, the truth of his ordeal was visible. His fingernails were bruised. His knuckles gleamed with black bruising, leaving raw, weeping sores. His knuckles were split, the skin peeled back to reveal the glistening white of bone. He lunged forward and grabbed Henderson's wrist. The superintendent's flesh yielded under Silas's grip, unnaturally soft, almost pliable. Henderson flinched, not from the strength of the hold, but from its clammy temperature. Feel that, Silas hissed, his voice a low, guttural rumble. I'm alive. Something happened in the park. A bug, a fungus, it put me under, but I fought my way out. They were wheeling me toward the cutting room. Henderson. I had to stop them. He pulled Henderson closer, forcing the man to look at his eyes. The whites were no longer white, but a murky, blood-flecked yellow. A fine web of black veins spread from his irises toward the corners. Henderson stared, his horror slowly curdling into a dawning, sickening comprehension. He lowered the cleaver, his own hands looking suddenly pale and small. 3 days in a drawer. Christ, Silas. No wonder you look like you do. Silas shuddered, a tremor racking his frame so violently it felt like his bones were rattling against each other. He almost had me, the one who does the cutting. Henderson slumped into the chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a flask. With trembling fingers, he unscrewed the cap and took a long swallow, his throat working convulsively. He held out to Silas. Drink. You look like you've been reassembled. Silas took the flask, the metal cool against his split knuckles. The whiskey scorched his throat, but it didn't feel like fire. It felt like nothing. He could barely taste it. They sat in silence, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator and a faint, rhythmic squelching from the bucket by the door. Henderson finally rose, his joints popping wetly with emotion. He wiped a sheen of viscous sweat from his brow with the back of a hand that was losing its shape, the knuckles sinking into pale, pliant flesh as if they were stones in soft mud. Look, he mumbled, the words slurring through teeth that seemed to be loosening in their gums. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on a point just over Silas's shoulder at the peeling wallpaper. Paperwork error. Front office will never know. Just stay put. Lock the door. And Silas try. He moved to the small, cluttered desk, his gait an unsteady lurch. His hands were still shaking, the tremors running up his arms in waves as he reached for the landline. The plastic receiver felt alien against his shifting skin. He dialed a number, his heart hammering a frantic, arrhythmic beat against his ribs. It rang 4 times, each tone a dull thud in his skull, before the mechanical click of the answering machine signaled. He hung up, the silence of the apartment feeling heavier than it had before, a thick, cloying thing that filled his lungs like fluid. He spent the next hour in a daze, his movements robotic and slow. He began to pull his dishes out of the cardboard boxes Henderson had started packing. Each clink of ceramic against the cupboard shelf sounded like a bone snapping in the quiet room. He put away the plates, the bowls, and the glasses, tried to reclaim the space that had almost been taken from him, his fingers leaving damp, soft smears on the cool, hard surfaces. The commute to his office downtown felt like a slow crawl through a world made of glass and exposed flesh. Silas stood on the train, his fingers gripping the cold metal pole, the flesh of his knuckles splitting and peeling back to reveal the yellowed bone beneath. He could feel people glancing at him, their eyes wide, their gazes sticking to the patches of translucent skin on his face, the way his jaw seemed to unhinge slightly when he swallowed. He felt exposed, not as a raw nerve, but as a cadaver walking through a crowd of the oblivious. Every vibration of the train car sent a sickening, wet crackle through his joints, and the fluorescent lights above flickered with a rhythmic, pulsing hum that seemed to match the slow, sluggish beat of his too large heart. When he stepped off the elevator on the 12th floor, the bustling noise of the open-plan office died a sudden, jagged death. Phones continued to ring, and the low drone of a copier persisted, but the human element went flat, replaced by a chorus of choked-back sobs and the wet clicking of tongues against teeth. Silas walked toward his desk, his sneakers squeaking on the industrial carpet, leaving faint, damp prints behind. Heads turned in a synchronized, slow-motion rubberneck, their eyes fixed on the way his suit hung loosely on his frame, the fabric stained with something dark and viscous. He saw Sarah from accounting drop her phone. He heard the collective intake of breath from the marketing pit. They didn't just look surprised, they looked horrified, as if a reanimated corpse had just walked into the room and sat down to check its email. Silas, his boss, Mr. Sterling, was standing in the doorway of his glass-walled office. He was holding a thick stack of manila folders, and as his eyes locked on Silas, his grip failed. The papers cascaded to the floor in a disorganized white wave, scattering like dead leaves. Sterling's face was the color of old ash, his jaw hanging open, a thin line of drool escaping from the corner of his mouth. We had a memorial service yesterday, Silas, Sterling stammered, his voice thin and papery like the rustle of dried skin. The hospital, the police, they said you were dead. We were waiting for the funeral, Silas. It was a mistake, Silas said, the words feeling like dry gravel in his mouth. The sound of his own voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his chest. A deep coma. Medical failure. I'm back. He smiled, and the skin on his cheeks stretched tight, cracking like old parchment. The 2 hours in Sterling's office stretched like a wound. The boss's gaze a physical pressure against the parchment-thin membrane of Silas's cheekbone. By lunch, Sterling, driven by the frantic scrabbling of a man burying a body in the legal documents, had signed a reinstatement, a desperate sacrilege against the profane thing sitting across from him. But normalcy was a language the office had forgotten how to speak. The air had curdled, thickening with a susurrus of dread that slithered between cubicle partitions. It was a sound that vibrated in Silas's teeth, a collective intake of breath held too long. It's like something died in the vents, a voice hissed, not quite a whisper. Smells of iron and fungus. It's him, another voice, sharp with revulsion. Look at his skin. It's crawling. Silas's eyes, dry and grit-filled, stared at the monitor, but the glowing lines of data had devolved into writhing, meaningless worms. He felt a slickness on his wrist, a cold weight, and looked down to see a thick, viscous glob of black ichor sliding from his cuff to pull on the escape key. It glistened under the fluorescent lights, a tiny, sentient darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walk home was a pilgrimage through colder and colder circles of hell. Each step was a negotiation with a body that no longer felt entirely his own. When he finally stumbled into his bathroom, the flickering bulb illuminated a truth far more grotesque than the dim light suggested. The face in the mirror was not his own. It was a death mask of bruised, necrotic flesh, the gray of week-old roadkill stretched taut over a skull that seemed subtly wrong, the jawline too sharp, the cheekbones too high. He lifted a trembling hand, and the fingers that met his reflection were elongated things, the skin pulled so tight over the bone that it was translucent, revealing the dark, knotted wood grain of the tissue beneath. His nails were no longer nails. They were shards of obsidian, split and razor-sharp, weeping the same black fluid that now stained his keyboard. He turned on the tap, the water a thunderous roar in the tiled room. He plunged his hands under the stream, but felt nothing. No heat, no cold, only the horrifying internal sensation of his own finger bones grating together, a dry, percussive clicking that echoed louder than the running water. It was the sound of a marionette's joints, of a thing being worn down from the inside out. With a choked sob, Silas yanked his sleeves down, the rough fabric scraping against the obsidian edges of his new claws. He fled the bathroom, the rhythmic clacking of his own skeleton pursuing him. In a frenzy of denial, he seized a bottle of pine-scented cleaner from under the sink, not cologne, and upended it over his head and clothes. The acrid chemical stench filled the small apartment, a burning cloud that did nothing to disguise the cloying sweetness of his own decay, a perfume of wet soil, blood, and something else, something fungal and hungry, that bloomed from his very pores. The scratching had become a constant, maddening rhythm. It wasn't just in the bedroom wall anymore. It was in the floorboards beneath his feet and the ceiling above his head. A dry, frantic scritch-scritch click that sounded like 1,000 tiny bone legs searching for a way in. He ignored it, his hands shaking as he reached for the phone. The skin on his knuckles split open as he gripped the receiver, revealing not red blood, but a thick, yellowish ooze. "Alara." "Hey, it's me again," he said to the machine, his voice sounding like dry leaves blowing across a grave. "I'm just heading to bed. Office was weird today, but I'm fine. Just really tired. See you soon." He collapsed into bed, but the sleep was not a rest. He woke up every hour, his skin feeling too tight for his frame, the darkness of the room pressing against his yellowing eyes like a physical weight. In the pale moonlight, he could see the fine, dark hairs sprouting from the backs of his hands, each one tipped with a glistening droplet of what looked like black oil. He chewed and swallowed, but the world had gone gray. There was no saltiness, no spice, no sweetness. His tongue felt like a piece of dead leather in a mouth that no longer knew how to taste life. The realization sent a cold shiver through him that made his ribs click. He ran his tongue over his teeth and felt the sharp, unfamiliar edges of new incisors pushing through his gums. He stumbled to the bathroom mirror and pulled his eyelids back. The whites were gone, replaced by a vibrant, sickly yellow that caught the light like a predator's gaze. "No," he whispered, the word a hollow wheeze. As he watched, his reflection's mouth twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. He fumbled in the medicine cabinet until he found a pair of dark, mirrored sunglasses. He slid them on, the world turning into a dim, shaded blur. He applied more cologne, a heavy, suffocating layer, until his skin felt damp with it. He looked like a man trying to play a part, a charcoal gray silhouette hiding a terrifying, glitching reality. The scratching in his own bones grew louder, a frantic counterpoint to the sound in the walls. He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, the scratching in the walls reaching a fever pitch as he turned the lock. He could feel creatures watching from the vents, their children's eyes tracking the man who was slowly becoming one of their own. His own fingers were beginning to elongate, the nails thickening into dark, chitinous claws that scraped against the doorknob, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The walk into the office was a pilgrimage of agony. With every step, Silas felt the grinding within, the sickening scrape of bone on bone, as if his own skeleton had shed its fleshy prison and was now trying to claw its way out from the inside. A dry, percussive clack-clack-clack echoed in the hollow of his skull, a rhythm only he could perceive. The cloying shroud of cologne he'd applied was a desperate chemical armor. Yet as he shuffled past the reception desk, he watched the young woman recoil, her face contorting, her pupils shrinking as if she'd glimpsed something predatory and unclean. He hadn't been at his desk for an hour before the summons arrived. Not a buzz on the intercom, but the physical presence of Mr. Sterling, who halted a full 5 feet from the cubicle, a man at the edge of chasm. Sterling's face was a mask of revulsion, one hand clamped over his mouth and nose, his eyes wide with a primal fear. "Silas, my office. Now." The journey was a tunnel of averted gazes and stifled coughs. Inside the glass box, Sterling remained standing, his back pressed to the window he'd thrown open to the city's roar. "Silas, look. This is difficult. The staff. They can't work. There's a stench. It's not just a smell, it's an assault. It's like decay and something else, something rotting from the inside out. Silas pushed the dark shades up the bridge of his nose. The jaundiced yellow of his irises smoldering like embers behind the smoked glass. The hospital said, "The medication for the coma, it has side effects." "I understand, I do," Sterling cut in, his voice a strained, trembling thing. "But you can't be in here. You're poisoning the air. Take your things. Work from home. Go see someone. A specialist. For God's sake, Silas, find out what's happening to you." Silas didn't speak. He moved with a stiff, puppet-like grace, gathering his belongings and leaving the building. The midday sun was a physical blow, its heat searing the ashen, tight-stretched skin of his face. He didn't go home. The thought of that apartment, of the ceaseless, frantic scratching from within the walls, from behind the plaster, was a fresh horror. He needed Alara. He needed her voice to stitch the unraveling edges of his being back together, to convince him he wasn't a thing decaying from the marrow out. He took the crosstown bus to her apartment, his sunglasses hiding the ruin of his eyes as the other passengers stared at the grayish cast of his skin. The key turned in the lock with a sound like grinding bone. It was the one she'd given him when forever still seemed possible. He let himself into the building, his heart, that decaying, sluggish thing, beating with a wet, laborious rhythm in his chest. He unlocked her door and stepped into the cool, dim hallway. The apartment smelled of expensive candles and something else, the warm, unmistakable scent of living flesh. He walked toward the bedroom, his movements unnaturally rigid, his joints protesting with soft, grating clicks. He pushed the door open. The scene was a razor blade scraping across his exposed nerves. She was in the tangled sheets, her dark hair splayed across the pillows. But she wasn't alone. A man, flushed with life, his skin warm and breathing, was beside her. Her eyes snapped open. She didn't scream with the shock of a caught lover. She let out a shrill, primal shriek of absolute, bone-deep terror. She scrambled back against the headboard, her hands clawing at the duvet as if to use it as a shield. "Silas," she screamed, her voice cracking. No, you're dead. You've been dead for over a week. I saw the bag. I saw them put you in the locker." The man beside her scrambled out of bed, his face pale as he stared at the gray-skinned, sunglass-wearing figure in the doorway. Silas stood there, the heavy scent of his cologne mixing with the sudden, sharp smell of her fear. His jaw, stiff with rigor, clicked as he tried to speak, but all that came out was a hollow, whistling sound from his throat. The sound that clawed its way out of Silas's throat was more grind than rasp. I came back for you." His black fingernails, brittle as charred wood, splintered against the doorframe, carving deep, jagged gouges that wept a fine, dark dust. "You're a ghost. You're a corpse." Alara's wail was a raw thing, tearing at the air. Her eyes, wide with a horrific realization, fixed on the impossible thing in her doorway. "Stay away from me. You're supposed to be in the ground." The bedroom became a vortex of screeching disbelief and papery, rattling pleas. Alara didn't just yell. She erupted with a hysterical, frantic violence, her arm whipping forward to hurl a heavy glass lamp. It detonated against the doorframe, a storm of glittering shrapnel raining down inches from Silas's head, a piece lodging itself in the waxy skin of his cheek. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. "Get out. Get out of my house," she shrieked, her voice climbing to a pitch that set the window panes humming like tuning forks. "I stood in that room. I smelled the formaldehyde. I watched them slide the drawer shut on your face. Silas, this is sick. Whoever is paying you to do this, whatever prank this is, it's over. You're a rot. You're a ghost. You're nothing." The man with her, his face a mask of terror, snatched a heavy decorative statue from a pedestal, brandishing it like a club. His eyes darted between Silas's unmoving shades and the gray, waxy skin of his throat, where a faint, dark line traced the path of the mortician's wide incision. Silas tried to speak, to tell her about the cold, the darkness, the way Frank had touched him, but his tongue felt like a thick piece of wet felt, swollen and useless in his mouth. Every time he tried to form a word, his jaw emitted a sharp, loud clack, a sound like a dry twig snapping, or a bone breaking. "Alara, please. Get out." He retreated. The motion was not a walk, but a series of jerks and stumbles, his limbs refusing to obey the memory of how they should move. He made his way through the hallway and out into the street, each step a discordant note in a symphony of decay. By the time he reached his own apartment, his body felt like a house of cards held together by nothing but rigor and the last, fading echo of a purpose he could no longer understand. His hand trembled as he raised it to the doorknob, and he watched, fascinated, as one of his blackened fingernails simply fell away, clattering onto the concrete with a sound like a final, tiny death. Once home, he stumbled toward the bathroom, the overhead light buzzing like a hornet's nest. He collapsed over the porcelain sink, his breath coming in shallow, whistling hitches. He gripped the edge of the basin so hard his fingers cramped, and that's when he felt the first sharp click in his mouth. He reached up, his hand shaking, and touched his front tooth. It didn't just wiggle. It swung on a hinge of soft, gray tissue. He gripped it with his blackened fingernails and pulled. There was no pain, no sharp sting of nerves, no warm rush of blood. Instead, there was a sickening wet schloop sound as the tooth slid out of the gum like a needle from butter. He stared at it in his palm, a white, ivory shard tipped with a clump of blackened, necrotic root. A second tooth followed, falling onto the porcelain with a tiny, musical tink before he could even reach for it. Silas groaned, a hollow sound that rattled in his chest, and as he reached up to wipe a string of thick, black ichor from his lip, his middle fingernail caught on the edge of his hoodie. He pulled back, and the entire nail plate snapped off. It didn't bleed. It peeled away in one solid, brittle piece, revealing the raw, gray, fatty tissue beneath. He watched in a frozen, wide-eyed trance as the flesh oozed and quivered like a jello. Silas let out a jagged, airless scream that turned into a wet, bubbly gurgle. His skin felt like it was unraveling, the portions beneath the surface beginning to shift and slide as the reweaving finally started to fail. He gripped the side of the mirror, and as he looked into his own yellow eyes, he heard it, not from the walls, but from inside his own chest. Wet pop. The city outside Silas's apartment was a pressure that threatened to liquefy his organs against his skeleton. He descended the stairs, each downward lurch accompanied by a wet, tearing sound as ligaments snapped and reknitted with audible pops. His knees didn't bend so much as they buckled, grinding together with the sound of stones in a cement mixer. Every joint was a seething knot of inflammation, the cartilage worn down to splintered bone shards that grated against each other with a sandpaper rasp. As he shuffled down the sidewalk, the wind gusted, and a sickening, greasy coldness washed over his scalp. Entire patches of skin and hair sloughed away, peeling back like wet parchment to expose the gleaming white dome of his skull beneath. The clumps didn't just fall. They oozed down his collar in dark, greasy strands. The scratching had breached the walls. It was no longer an external sound, but a tangible vibration crawling beneath his own skin, a frantic scuttling of chitinous legs against the inside of his sternum. He could feel them, a nest of segmented things, their sharp points scraping and testing the integrity of his ribs from within, a constant, internal drumbeat of his own slow decay. He escaped into the night, assured the air outside would settle his nerves, positive the horror of the bathroom was a hallucination. His life was a living nightmare, but his luck hadn't changed as he became disoriented and slid down into a dark alleyway. Wallet, the watch, the phone, everything. The mugger spat, his eyes wide, the stench of his fear a sour tang in the air. His tremoring hand aimed a pistol. Silas remained motionless, a monument to entropy. Behind the dark shades, his jaundiced eyes held the flat, predatory stillness of a reptile. A slow, rhythmic clacking began, not from his jaw, but from deep within his throat, the sound of hard, bony plates knocking together. The mugger's bravado evaporated as a thick, cloying wave of Silas's cologne hit him, a cloying sweetness layered over the sharp, coppery reek of festering meat and something else, something like damp soil and decay. "I said now, you piece of shit." or I'll. His threat dissolved into a wet gargle. A second figure detached from the oppressive dark behind him, a man whose body seemed to be unraveling at the seams, his movements jerky and unnatural. In one hand, he gripped not a knife, but a shard of his own sharpened rib, slick with a dark, viscous fluid. Before the mugger could even register the horror, the figure lunged. There was no plunge, no simple stab. The sharpened bone punched through the mugger's back with a wet, sucking sound, erupting from his chest in a spray of arterial crimson and glistening fragments of lung tissue. The knife man didn't look back. He ripped the gun from the dying man's twitching fingers and plunged into the night, his footsteps slapping against the wet brick, each beat a frantic, fading pulse. Silas stood motionless in the sudden, wet silence of the alley. Where the hot blood had sprayed against his neck and chest, he felt a strange, tingling warmth, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, a slick, alien heat that seemed to sink into his very bones. He reached up with a trembling hand, his fingers smearing the liquid viscously across his skin. To his disbelief, the flesh beneath was no longer the color of brittle, ancient parchment. It was smooth, firm, and possessed a healthy, living hue. The deep, canyon-like cracks in his flesh were sealing themselves shut, the edges knitting together with a sickening, wet squelch, as if they had never existed. The scratching inside him did not stop. Instead, the rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch grew more urgent, a frantic vibration against his ribs that felt like 1,000 tiny claws trying to claw their way out from within his own skeleton. The grinding pain in his joints began to dull, replaced by a terrifyingly efficient strength, a feeling of sinew and muscle knitting themselves back together with unnatural speed. He looked down at the scene, the persistent noise in his head drowning out the distant sounds of the city, a cacophony of wet, hungry sounds. The transformation was beginning, fueled by the accidental violence of the night, leaving Silas to wonder what he was becoming and what the scratching would demand next. The answer came soon. Silas stood frozen as the wet, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scratch reached a fever pitch. From the shadows of the alley floor, a shimmering carpet of ivory bone-centipedes surged forward, a tide of polished, segmented horrors. They didn't move like insects. They rattled like a spilled bag of teeth, their dry, skeletal legs clicking against the pavement in a frantic, hungry unison, a sound like 1,000 tiny castanets of death. They ignored Silas at first, swarming over the mugger's twitching body like a living wave of ivory, a churning mass of legs and carapace. Silas watched, transfixed behind his dark shades, as the 1 to 2 inch creatures bored into the man's clothing. Their legs, sharp as surgical saws, tipped with barbs of what looked like obsidian, shredded through denim and cotton in seconds, leaving behind a trail of tattered, blood-soaked rags. The horror was clinical and absolute. As the centipedes reached the skin, they didn't just bite, they burrowed. Silas could see the mugger's flesh beginning to pulse and ripple as hundreds of the bone bugs dove beneath the surface, seeking the soft, fatty tissue. The man's legs and torso began to lose their shape, the skin sagging and turning into a translucent, vibrating bag, a grotesque, living vessel for the horrors within. Then came the sound, the wet percussion of marrow pulverized into paste. The centipedes vibrated, a frequency that made the mugger's bones dissolve, their structural integrity collapsing into a slurry of calcium and blood. Silas watched the man's form slump, the once solid framework of his body caving in, leaving only a quivering sack of flesh. The skeleton, now just a flavor in the gore. The centipedes moved with a horrifying purpose, their pale bodies staining crimson as they glutted themselves on the marrow and grease. The mugger was being excavated, his viscera and tissues methodically stripped, leaving behind a hollowed-out cavity, a human-shaped void being filled with the writhing mass of his own consumption. Suddenly, a dozen of the bone centipedes swiveled their cataract-clouded heads towards Silas. Their legs clicked, a dry, menacing rhythm that resonated deep within Silas's own newly knitted bones. A sharp, Invasive pulling sensation seized his hand. The burrower beneath his flesh was sending a summons to its brethren. The scratching inside his skull was no longer a mere irritation. It was an insistent, gnawing hunger. The silence of the alley was torn apart by a sound not of screaming, but of wet, rhythmic tearing, the very fabric of flesh being unspooled. From the vertical shadows of the brickwork to the 10-legged, eye-covered flesh spiders bloomed into existence. They didn't emerge. They erupted, bursting through the air like ruptured pustules, hitting the pavement with the wet, percussive splatter of a bucket of offal dropped from a rooftop. 10 spindly, crab-like legs, brittle, sharp, and translucent as old, yellowed keratin, scuttled for purchase on the slick, blood-soaked stone. Their thoraxes were pulsating nodes of necrotic tissue, the size of a clenched fist, radiating a palpable, feverish heat that wafted a greasy, metallic stench of decay into the night. Dozens of eyes, some filmed over with cataracts, others a piercing, childlike blue, rolled in a frantic, unblinking dance, weeping a thick, vitreous fluid that slicked their path like the trail of a gastropod. They swarmed the mugger's liquefied remains, a mechanical frenzy of dismemberment. Their legs moved in a blur of cold, calculated efficiency, snipping through the taut, boneless skin with a series of wet, tearing sounds. They ripped away long, perfect strips of muscle, the flesh separating with the sound of gristle tearing. Silas watched as a harvester clamped down on a swath of the man's thigh, its legs vibrating until they were a shimmering blur, reweaving the raw meat into a compact, geometric cube of flesh in mere seconds. The creatures worked with frantic, nauseating efficiency, rending away entire strips of flesh, their multi-jointed limbs sinking in as soft tissue to the bone. They would vanish back into the alley's Stygian crevices with their wet, dripping prizes, only to materialize moments later, their chittering mouths agape. The mugger was being flayed alive, his screams reduced to wet, bubbling gasps as his body became a canvas of tearing muscle and rupturing organs. The air grew thick with the coppery tang of fresh blood, mingling with the sour stench of bile and the cloying, sweet perfume of the harvester's own decaying flesh, a scent of wet soil and festering wounds. Within minutes, the man was no more. Not a shard of bone remained, not a shred of his cheap clothing. Where he had fallen, the concrete was now a shallow, sizzling crater filled with a viscous, black sludge. The harvester's digestive effluvia, a chemical caustic that warped and melted the asphalt, sent up a foul-smelling steam that clung to the walls. The last dark harvester did not retreat. It scurried towards Silas on its spindly, chitinous legs, the sharp, brittle clicks echoing in the sudden quiet. It halted before him, its multitude of milky, infantile eyes rolling up to meet the dark lenses of his sunglasses. A ripple ran through its glistening, pulsating thorax, and a thin, multi-jointed proboscis, slick with mucus, uncurled to offer him something. It was a piece of the mugger, but it had been sculpted with a horrifying artistry. The flesh and sinew had been compacted and desiccated into a dense, dark puck, the texture of jerky or dried leather. It was encased in a translucent, greasy membrane, shimmering like a strip of cured intestine, still twitching with a vestigial, nerve-firing life. It was a selection, a prime morsel prepared with grotesque precision for Silas. The creature's eyes swam in their sockets, a final, frantic dance, and it emitted a soft, wet sigh, a sound of escaping gases and bodily fluids. Then, it blinked out of existence, leaving Silas alone in the alley's suffocating silence, the warm, gift-wrapped piece of his would-be killer resting in his palm. Silas stood in the cooling shadows, his fingers slick with the oily secretions of the membrane as he worked at the edges. The cookie pulsed with a deep, metabolic warmth, a thrumming heat that seemed to seep into his very bones. A hollow, ancient hunger, a craving that predated his own memory, roared to life inside him. He brought the rewoven morsel to his lips, the scent of cooked meat, and something else, something chemical and sweet, filling his nostrils and bit down. His teeth sank through the gristly membrane and into the compressed, fibrous flesh, the taste of another man's life bursting across his tongue in a hot, coppery wave. The taste wasn't an explosion, but a slow, seeping flood. It coated his tongue with the coppery slickness of old blood, the flavor of something deeply, fundamentally alive. As the liquid slid down his throat, a current buzzed through his veins, not lightning, but the dull thrum of faulty wiring. His body didn't restructure with a dramatic snap. It shifted with the sickening, organic sound of wet clay being molded. The skin of his hands didn't just turn pink. It bloomed from beneath the surface, a mottled, inflamed rash that slowly settled into a disturbingly perfect flesh tone. His fingernails didn't snap off cleanly. They curled, blackened, and peeled away like old paint, revealing the glistening, too-quick growth of new ones beneath, sharp and uncannily white. Inside his mouth, his gums weren't just hot. They swelled, a dense, pulpy mass pressing against his jawbone before receding, leaving behind the hard, foreign shapes of teeth clicking into alignment with a series of tiny, wet pops. The burning on his scalp wasn't a fire. It was a pinpointed, crawling sensation, as if 1,000 tiny insects were burrowing through his skin, pulling thick, dark threads from the depths of his pores to clot and mat against his neck.